Every year, Canada records how many people die, and they also estimate how many will die. It's one of the most basic tools a country has to measure its health. But after COVID, something strange ended up happening because the number of Canadians dying each year ended up rising significantly from what the prediction ended up being. Even after the pandemic ended, we have a new 2025 report that is trying to explain as to why this is the case, and when you start reading the report carefully, the answers don't really line up. In fact, the deeper you go, the more questions you start finding. So today we are going to look into what the government-owned statistics are saying and what they don't say about the rise in debt that no one seems willing to explain. My name is Seb, and welcome to the Canadian Wilbury. So let's begin by explaining the concept of excess debt. This is the phenomenon where more people end up dying in Canada than what was expected. Overdebt remain a serious problem in Canada for all age group, especially for year 2022, as per the report is saying. And one of the reasons as to why is because no clear explanation is given by any level of government as to what is going on. Statistic Canada and their actuaries and all these kinds of people are calculating mortality rate in a single year, year after year after year in Canada. And these statistics can be extremely useful for certain industries that are trying to evaluate the cost of debt. Life insurance companies, for example, or if you are studying any change in demographic, trying to evaluate the amount of Canadian that may end up dying in a year can give some really good direction as to how to manage some of those businesses. Excess mortality is the term that is used by these experts when more people end up dying than what the statistics are showing. Keep in mind that these deaths are an estimate and these are more projection than anything else. For the sake of this video, I am going to call this phenomenon overdebt just to simplify everything. One thing is certain when we are looking at this report is that the overdebt for year 2020, 2021, and 2022, all of them are consistently above average for every single age group, especially for people under the age of 45. You'll see what I mean in a moment when I am going to share some of those statistics, because all of the numbers that you are going to see are from Statistic Canada, and they ended up releasing some very interesting numbers. As you can see here, one of the reasons as to why we might explain all of these over debt is because of COVID itself. COVID was not planned, nobody saw this coming, and so this disease is arriving out of nowhere, killing more Canadians than what we expected, hence the reason why more people ended up dying because of it. However, have a look at 2022, because 2022, the year, is showing a very interesting trend. Because you see, even after we have 80% vaccination rate for all age category all across the country, overdebt not only is still present, but it's stronger than ever before. That's the part in orange that you see on top of the blue line for 2022, where it says 31,370. That's the amount of Canadians that ended up over dying. Technically, it should have gone down, especially for 2022 and 2023, because if COVID became the silent killer, everybody was vaccinated, the disease was technically defeated as society started to reopen. But these numbers are not going down, they're going up. They've been peaking, especially in 2022. Why is this the case? Overdebt was higher 2 years after the beginning of COVID, especially during COVID. So more people are dying once COVID is over. Something is killing Canadians during those 2 years. And it was not COVID because everybody was vaccinated. Then what was it? And why are our government do not look into this? Now, excess debt is not only a Canadian problem. The same pattern is showing all across the Western world, especially for year 2022. And it raises a single big question. Because if more than 80% of Canadians ended up being vaccinated and supposedly protected from COVID by 2022, then why so many people ended up overdying? The data is telling a strange story because a lot of people didn't die of COVID, but they sure ended up dying with COVID. And it is a very important distinction to make because it completely changes how the numbers are looking. Here's what the World Health Organization is saying about this at the time. Open quote, COVID-19 should be recorded on the medical certificate of cause of death for all dissident where the disease caused or is assumed to have caused or contributed to death. End quote. That one line opened the door to a massive gray area because every death connected to COVID, even loosely, could now be counted as one COVID death. And that broadened the definition, inflating the total of death dramatically. Suddenly, the statistic made COVID appear more deadlier than it really was, while pushing all other causes of death into the back burner. So the question is, how deadly was COVID really? Well, if we look at Canadians age 65 and under, excess deaths stayed unusually high from 2020 to 2023, and much of that had nothing to do with the virus itself. Even in 2022 and 2023, after all the mandates ended up being lifted off and life supposedly went back to normal, the number of people dying was still far above what it would normally be expected. So this is where the real issue is. While government focus on counting COVID deaths, sometimes in the most generous way possible, they fail to investigate the rise in other kind of death. And these other causes were underreported, underexplained, and sadly, largely ignored. Lockdowns were not easy on anyone, but they ended up hitting our youth the hardest. What started as an effort to protect our healthcare system ended up turning millions of Canadians into prisoners within their own homes. And that came with consequences, a whole chain of reaction of social and health problems, the constant fear and stress from daily COVID headlines about these over-exaggerated debt that we covered earlier, businesses that have been forced to shut down, leaving their owners in financial and emotional ruin. Schools ended up shutting down, cutting kids and teenagers from friends, teachers, routine, their sports activities, workers facing layoff and broken supply chains, and the worst of all, limited access to care, support, and some very important medical attention. All of that became the perfect storm. And by the mid-2020, Canadians were already breaking down. And when people start to break, their health follows. Hypertension, diabetes, alcohol abuse, drug overdose, all of these ended up spiking during lockdown. For young Canadians who were largely immune to COVID's worst effect, it was this indirect cause that dealt the real damage to them. Have a look at the following graphic here. Those 3 steps where you see the 3 red line and the green kind of up and down kind of line. Each one of these steps represent death per week among Canadians under the age of 45. And that third step, the highest on the right, marked the lockdown years, 2020 and beyond. Now, those deaths didn't go back down after society started to reopen. Even in 2023, as you can see here, long after all the restrictions ended up ending, these deaths per week stayed higher than before the pandemic. So that's the part nobody wants to talk about. In trying to protect us from COVID, we may have created a wave of death that has nothing to do with the virus itself. "2022 and 2023 ended up being the deadliest years in Canada. Even with COVID supposedly behind all of us, a massive vaccination rate on top of that, the numbers tell another story. Over death ended up remaining very high. And one of the most disturbing trends in that we see this in children's age 14 and under. COVID did not kill our children's, and thank God for that. But after COVID, the numbers ended up going the wrong way. As you can see here on page 32 of the report, look at the line 2021. That's the green line. You see a blue line, and on top of it you see a tiny little number. That's 616. That's the amount of children in Canada that ended up dying age 14 and under. Look at what happened in 2022. We ended up going from 616 to 788 deaths. This is a 25% rise in one single year. For kids who were never in danger of COVID, this is terrifying, because look at 2023. We went down to 785. It didn't move. Something is killing those children, and it's not COVID. Another demographic, death among Canadians under the age of 45 also ended up remaining way higher than expected long after the pandemic was declared over. Let's go even up in the aging pyramid. So let's go into the 45 to 65 age group. This report is showing that roughly 7,500 more deaths than normal ended up happening across 2022 and 2023 combined together. And when it comes to our senior citizen, as you can see here on page 34 of the report, 2022 also ended up being a record year. 24,000 more seniors ended up dying than what was expected. Keep in mind, the government ended up saying that, 18,000 of those deaths were from COVID, but this is where things are getting puzzled. Because if you look at the statistic from 2020, even before the vaccine ever existed, COVID ended up claiming the life of 15,800 senior citizens in Canada. In 2022, when you have over a 95% of vaccination rate, we went from 15 to 18,000. Something doesn't add up here, because that protection was supposed to be stronger, and yet we see the complete opposite. More people are dying, and it's not COVID. With 95% vaccination, it should not be COVID. And this is a fair question. What did ended up killing all of those senior citizens? And no one in our government seems to be in a hurry to give us any kind of answers. Now, I could go on with hours with this report because I ended up barely covering half of it. And this document shows that when a government is trying to protect its people, it may have caused more harm than it tried to prevent in the first place. Oh, and I have one final detail to you guys. Yeah, because this is the 2025 reports, and with all the data that getting up being corrected and updated and all of that, can you imagine that all debt in 2022, 12% of them still remain unexplainable to this day? It means that tens of thousands of Canadians within a G7 country ended up dying, and the government, the medical field, doctors, everybody, none of them are able to explain why. 1 in 8 deaths remain inexplicable in year 2022, when most of the over death ended up happening. Let that sink in for a second. This is what this report is telling all of us. Now, I know most of you are tired of hearing of COVID. I get it. We just want to move on with our life and be done with it. But we cannot forget that this entire episode may have ended up killing more Canadians through bad policies than through the virus itself. And it ended up leaving a deep scar on an entire generation of teenagers and young adults whose best year ended up being sacrificed to protect and secure their grandparents. Because nobody in Canada ended up paying the price of this mismanagement. And I believe that no one will ever will unless we start to ask the hard question and put pressure on our political leaders. So I'm gonna say this especially to you young Canadians. You were the one who ended up suffering the most 5 years ago, and you're the one who will have to fight the hardest to make sure that this kind of failure will never happen again. Because those scars of yours, they're never gonna go away. And if we do not hold our leaders accountable, they're just going to end up repeating the same mistake over and over again. Thanks for watching.